We all know the great battles of the Middle Ages. Crécy, Agincourt, Poitiers, and Bouvines all come to mind. But here's the truth most people don't realize. These iconic clashes were rare. More often, medieval warfare looked very different. Knights weren't riding in glorious charges, they were burning farms, looting villages, and terrorizing the countryside. This was the Chevauchée, literally defined as a mounted raid, and it was the weapon that crippled kingdoms. And while it may sound like banditry, it was one of the most effective strategies in medieval warfare, used from the Dark Ages through the early modern period. In fact, many battles like Crécy were fought in the context of these raids. We've covered Crécy in detail in our last few videos, so check those out if you haven't already. But today we're shifting focus to the war between the battles. At the end, let me know if this video changes your perception on knights and chivalry at all, and let me know if you agree with my statement that chevauchés may have helped the rise of one of France's greatest legends. But let's go ahead and get started. The idea of mounted raids to attack an enemy's economic base is as old as the history of mounted warfare. Raids for livestock and especially horses were common amongst nomadic peoples. In fact, the Huns practiced mounted raiding on a grand scale, one that the Black Prince could only dream of emulating. However, mounted raids were also associated with people we don't think of as elite cavalrymen. Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention the Vikings of the Great Heathen Army using mounted raiders to plunder English towns and villages. The speed of the horses allowed the Vikings to use similar surprise tactics to those they used from their longships. In the Middle East, the Bedouin Gaza was a campaign of avoiding battle by raiding and attacking the enemy's economy, usually by stealing livestock, and during the Muslim conquest, the Arabs practiced a tactic called razzia, a surprise raid on an enemy village or non-military target. This was later adopted by the Spanish kingdoms and referred to as the cavalgada. While these terms hold slightly different meanings, the core concept of horsemen plundering civilian economic targets remains the same, and in 12th century Western Europe, the tactic was rapidly refining into what would later be called the chevauchée. But what did this tactic look like? Was it organized, or was it just a rampage by rogue knights? The answer is that the chevauchée was highly organized, often state-sponsored, and sometimes led by the leading men of the kingdom. Even before the term chevauchée was used, contemporary sources such as the early 13th century history of William Marshall make it clear that these raids were highly organized. From this and other contemporary works, we can see how the raiders were divided into specific roles. Some men were charged with being scavengers who plundered homes, others with stealing livestock, and some were incendiaries whose job was, unsurprisingly, to start fires. The brutality is captured in contemporary sources which describe raiders torching houses, forcing the poor inhabitants to either be, quote, burned alive or led away with their hands tied. Count Philip of Flanders relates that the goal was to ensure that, quote, nothing was left by which in the morning they could have a meal. These raids were wholesale destruction. Moreover, contemporary chronicles make it clear that orders for these raids came straight from the top. In his biography, William Marshall is seen advising King Henry II to launch a devastating mounted raid into French territory in retaliation for a similar French raid. The king tells Marshall, "You are an excellent man and have given me wise counsel. It shall be done exactly as you say." Moreover, the history makes frequent mention of these raids, with William participating in at least two in the year 1188 alone. Both were in response to similar raids by the King of France, and this shows that these early chevauchée-type raids were not uncommon at all, but rather a staple of medieval warfare, far more common than major battles. And kings weren't just authorizing the raids, they were actively leading them. As I mentioned at the start of the video, the Battle of Crécy was fought in the context of a large-scale chevauchée. King Edward III launched a raid into northern France to divert French attention away from Gascony, which was under attack by a French army of around 20,000 men. About 10 years later, the Black Prince was leading the English and Gascon army on two different chevauchées. One in 1355 was so successful that the historian Clifford Rogers states the, quote, damage to the French economy cannot be overstated. The second in 1356 culminated in the English victory at Poitiers. King Edward was also intending to lead a large chevauchée into northern France that year, but could not due to the arrival of a small fleet of Aragonese galleys hired by the French. So, should this type of state-led robbery and murder affect our view of medieval knights and chivalry? As always, judging morals across centuries is difficult. However, what is clear is that medieval contemporaries felt that this was an accepted and perhaps even praiseworthy part of medieval warfare. For example, the history of William Marshal was commissioned by his son, and therefore the biographer goes to great lengths to paint William as a paragon of chivalry and knighthood. This same biographer seems proud to record how William advised the old king to launch chevauchées into French lands. In addition, later on, he describes happily how William and his men rode through French lands, quote, burning, pillaging, and plundering as they went. He even makes the claim that these raids could be an act of high chivalry, based on the assumption that the raids could force a quick end to the war, ultimately saving lives. Moreover, the participation of figures such as the Black Prince suggests that there wasn't a stigma associated with this type of warfare. Edward of Woodstock was widely regarded as a chivalrous prince, even by his enemies. But how did medieval contemporaries reconcile these concepts? How does chivalry and defending the poor equate to organized arson, robbery, and murder? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. For me, the answer is that the Chevauchée was effective on many levels, both in controlling costs and in terms of its strategic impacts. I'll discuss strategy in a minute, but let's focus on cost first. I go into more detail on this in my videos on contract indentures and the French men-at-arms, but suffice to say that fielding an army was a costly endeavor. On the low end, the monthly wages for the English army at Crécy were around £8,000 to £9,000, a fourth of the king's yearly income. And that's just the wages, not the cost of feeding and transporting the men and horses. Provisions and spare equipment would be further drains on the English treasury. The Chevauchée was a way to lighten some of the logistical load. Froissart discusses the French decision in 1346 to remove food stores from the southern side of the Somme. This quickly caused supply problems for Edward III and influenced him to force a crossing to the northern side of the Somme where the French had not removed provisions from. The ability to plunder these French provisions once again caused the English army to be well fed and well supplied. This demonstrates that the food stolen during the Chevauchée was important for keeping the army supplied. It's likely that medieval commanders even planned on this, and we can surmise that from how fast supplies ran out after the French started stripping the land of provisions ahead of the English army. Moreover, contracts showed that the English kings had a direct financial benefit from the looting. Per the contracts of the Agincourt campaign, we see that King Henry is entitled to a third of his men's plunder. While this may seem like a small amount, it would certainly add up over a few thousand men. These factors all combine to make the Chevauchée a cost-effective method for waging war. Added on to this are the economic, military, and political impacts of this strategy, and here's something that might surprise you. It's actually the political impacts that were the most valuable, and I'll explain my crazy theory in just a minute. But first, let's cover the obvious. As a devastating mounted raid, the Chevauchée's economic impacts are clear. The army not only stole goods and livestock, but also torched and demolished many villages. The history of William Marshal notes, quote, when the peasants can no longer reap the harvest, they can no longer pay their rents, and this impoverishes the lord. In many cases, such as Henry II's 12th century campaigns in Aquitaine, this economic damage was enough to force a surrender. Militarily, the Chevauchée was effective in reducing an opponent's ability to field and sustain large armies. During the Poitiers campaign, previous English Chevauchées had impoverished the French crown to the point that they struggled to pay the wages for their own army. And also, since the Chevauchée was a mounted raid, it had an advantage in mobility. The Black Prince used this advantage to his benefit to select and prepare the battlefield at Poitiers. However, it was the political aspects that I claimed were the most important, and I promised to explain myself, and so here we go. Basically, it boils down to this. Fields can be replanted, towns can be rebuilt, but shattered reputations can last a lifetime. You see, medieval society was centered around a system of obligations, the famous feudal contract, and like all contracts, there are two sides. If a lord couldn't provide protection against chevauchées, he was breaking his side of the contract just as a peasant who refused to pay his rents. This could make a lord look dangerously weak and impotent, even cowardly, and a weak or impotent lord was inviting rebellion. We see this in 1355 in France after the devastating English Chevauchées of that year. When King John tried to raise an army via the Arrière-Ban, many French lords from Normandy simply refused to answer the call, and some eventually shifted their loyalty to the English. Thus, we can see the economic, military, and political impacts of the Chevauchée, but we can't discuss this brutal aspect of medieval warfare without discussing the human cost. In nearly all instances, it was the common folk who suffered the most. In the best case scenario, they might escape with their lives, but very little else. In the worst case scenario, they might be burned alive or cut down in cold blood by the raiders, or they might be kidnapped and made to work on a foreign lord's land. And for women, there were all the crimes that men can perpetrate against women in times of war. These violent raids left deep scars on the civilian population, and we actually know this because of one of history's most famous women, Joan of Arc. When she was a young girl, Joan's village was subjected to a devastating raid, likely led by Burgundian forces. It was shortly after this that she started to have her visions. While Joan's military contributions are a topic for another video, as are her visions, her rise is almost inextricably linked to the collective trauma of repeated chevauchées. To understand this, you need to put yourself in a French peasant's shoes. You're living in a semi-apocalyptic scenario where fire and death could sweep down on you at any moment. In such scenarios, people start to embrace savior ideologies. Thus, the French people, up to and including some lords, were willing to embrace the idea of a savior maiden from Lorraine who was destined to save France, a series of events that we'll discuss at a later time. But what do you think about the Chevauchée? As I asked at the start, does this change your views on knights and chivalry at all? Let me know in the comment section below, and as always, take care until the next time.